The room went dead silent. 17 million viewers held their breath. Nancy Mace had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and Jasmine Crockett was about to remind America what real power looks like when it speaks without shouting. What happened next wasn't just political theater. It was a seismic shift that would split the nation and redefine what courage means in the halls of power. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The morning of April 15th started like any other in Washington, D.C. But by noon, it would become the day that changed everything. Committee Room 2154 in the Rayburn House Office Building had hosted thousands of hearings over the decades, but none quite like this one. The mahogany panels gleamed under fluorescent lights. The marble floors reflected the morning sun streaming through tall windows, and the wooden podium stood ready for what was supposed to be a routine discussion on federal education funding. But everyone in that room knew better. This wasn't about budgets or appropriations. This was about two visions of America sitting across from each other at a polished table, and only one would walk away with their reputation intact. At the left end of the committee bench sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, a 43-year-old civil rights attorney turned congresswoman from Texas. Her navy blue blazer was pressed to perfection, her gold earrings caught the overhead lights, and her hands rested calmly on a thick manila folder marked Educational Equity Data, Confidential. She'd been up since 4 a.m., not because she was nervous, but because she was prepared. 20 years of courtroom battles had taught her that the truth doesn't need theatrics. It just needs to be spoken clearly enough to cut through the noise. Across from her, Representative Nancy Mace adjusted her pristine white blazer with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the room. The South Carolina Congresswoman had built her career on being the sharp-tongued voice of conservative values, the woman who could deliver cutting remarks with a camera-ready smile and walk away unscathed. Her folder was thinner than Jasmine's, but her certainty was absolute. She wasn't here to learn. She was here to perform for the cameras she knew were rolling. The gallery behind them was packed beyond capacity. Reporters from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and a dozen other networks had claimed every available seat. Their cameras were already rolling, capturing every angle for what everyone expected to be standard political theater. Staffers clutched notebooks and tablets, ready to capture quotes for their bosses. A handful of college students on Congressional internships watched from the back, wide-eyed at being so close to power, unaware they were about to witness a masterclass in political destruction. The air conditioning hummed quietly, mixing with the soft murmur of whispered conversations and the rustle of papers. Someone's phone buzzed on silent mode. A camera lens adjusted with a barely audible whir. These were the sounds of normalcy, of routine, of just another day in the machinery of American democracy. None of them knew they were about to witness history being made one devastating sentence at a time. Chairman Robert Williams, a gray-haired Democrat from Oregon with 30 years of congressional experience, tapped his gavel once against the wooden block. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber like a starting pistol. "The committee will come to order," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "Today we're examining the federal role in addressing educational equity and the effectiveness of current diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in our nation's schools. We'll hear from—" The words were barely out of his mouth before Nancy Mace leaned into her microphone, her voice cutting through the formal atmosphere like a blade through silk. She hadn't waited to be recognized, hadn't followed protocol. This was her first mistake, but not her last. "Mr. Chairman, with all due respect," she began, her southern accent lending a deceptive sweetness to her words. "I think we need to stop calling this equity and start calling it what it really is. Divisive propaganda that's tearing our children apart." A ripple of tension moved through the gallery like a stone dropped in still water. Reporters straightened in their seats, pens poised over notebooks. This was already more confrontational than anyone had expected from what was supposed to be a routine hearing on education funding. Mace continued, her confidence growing with each word, feeding off the attention she could feel focusing on her like stage lights. "What we're seeing in classrooms across America isn't education, it's indoctrination. We're teaching white children to be ashamed of their heritage and telling minority children they're victims before they can even read properly." She paused for effect, letting her words settle like dust after an explosion. Her media training was evident in every calculated pause, every practiced inflection. This isn't progress. This is institutional racism in reverse. And frankly, I'm tired of being told that questioning these programs makes me a racist. The real racism is the soft bigotry of low expectations that these so-called equity programs represent. The room was electric now. You could feel the tension crackling between the Democratic and Republican sides of the committee like opposing charges in a thunderstorm. Republican members nodded approvingly at Mace's words. Democratic members shifted uncomfortably, some scribbling notes, others whispering to their staffers. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded calmly on her folder, but something had shifted in her posture. Her shoulders had straightened almost imperceptibly, and her eyes had locked onto Mace with laser focus. Anyone who knew Jasmine well would have recognized the signs, the slight tilt of her head, the way her fingers had gone completely still. She wasn't angry. She was calculating. Chairman Williams cleared his throat and nodded toward Jasmine. "The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes." Jasmine leaned forward slowly, deliberately, like a chess master considering her next move. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of experience that couldn't be manufactured or performed. There was no southern sweetness here, no political polish, just the straightforward directness of someone who had spent her career in courtrooms where facts mattered more than feelings. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I find it interesting that my colleague from South Carolina speaks about division while using language that's been dividing this country for centuries." She didn't raise her voice, but somehow every word seemed to echo through the chamber. The quality of silence in the room changed. It became the kind of quiet that comes when people realize they're about to hear something important. "When you say soft bigotry of low expectations, Congresswoman Mace, you're not talking about helping children succeed. You're talking about maintaining a system that has failed black and brown students for generations while pretending that failure is somehow their fault." Jasmine opened her folder with deliberate care and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The document was thick with highlighter marks and handwritten notes in the margins, the tools of someone who had done her homework. "Let me share some facts that might make people uncomfortable," she continued, looking directly at the cameras before returning her gaze to Mace. "But facts don't care about comfort, and children's futures don't care about political talking points." The room leaned in collectively. Every camera zoomed closer. Even the most experienced reporters could sense that something significant was building. In Mississippi, black students are suspended at 3 times the rate of white students for identical infractions. Not similar infractions, identical ones. When a black child and a white child commit the same rule violation, the black child is 3 times more likely to face suspension. She looked up from her paper, her eyes finding Mace across the table. "In Alabama, schools with majority black enrollment receive $1,500 less per student in state and local funding than majority white schools. In South Carolina, my colleague's own state, the achievement gap between white and black students hasn't improved in 15 years, despite millions in federal funding that was supposed to address exactly this problem." Nancy Mace's confident expression was beginning to crack. Her fingers had started drumming against the table before she caught herself and forced them to stillness. This wasn't the soft target she'd expected to find across from her. Jasmine wasn't finished. "These aren't opinions, Congresswoman Mace. These aren't feelings or theories or political talking points. These are the documented results of a system that my colleague seems determined to protect from any scrutiny or reform." She pulled out another document, this one showing charts and graphs in stark black and white. "And here's what happens when we don't address these inequities. Black students are twice as likely to be placed in special education programs they don't need, half as likely to be placed in gifted programs they do qualify for, and 6 times more likely to face zero-tolerance discipline policies for subjective infractions like defiance or disrespect." The weight of the statistics was crushing. Even Republican committee members were looking uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with their constituents in the gallery. So, when you talk about divisive propaganda, what you're really talking about is data. When you complain about programs designed to address these documented inequities, what you're really complaining about is accountability. And when you use phrases like soft bigotry of low expectations, what you're really doing is projecting. The last word landed like a bomb. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped. Nancy Mace's face had gone from confident to flushed to pale in the space of 5 minutes. "The gentlewoman's time has expired," Chairman Williams announced, but Nancy Mace was already reaching for her microphone with shaking hands. "Point of personal privilege, Mr. Chairman." Her voice was higher now, strained. "I cannot let these accusations stand unchallenged." The chairman hesitated, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering, but parliamentary procedure demanded he allow the response. "The gentlewoman from South Carolina is recognized." What came next would later be analyzed by political scientists as a textbook example of how privilege can become a weapon that wounds its wielder. Nancy Mace had built her career on being the controlled, camera-ready voice of conservative values. But Jasmine's systematic dismantling of her arguments had rattled her more than she'd ever been rattled in a political setting. I deeply resent the implication that I'm somehow protecting a racist system," Mace began, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "My record on civil rights speaks for itself. I've voted for funding increases, I've supported bipartisan educational reforms, and I've worked across the aisle more than most members of this committee." She was speaking faster now, her southern accent becoming more pronounced as her emotional temperature rose. "What I won't support is dividing our children by race, teaching them to see everything through the lens of oppression and victimhood, and telling parents they have no say in their children's education because some bureaucrat in Washington thinks they know better." Jasmine remained perfectly still during this outburst, but there was something in her expression, not smugness, not anger, but a kind of patient recognition. She'd been in rooms like this before, with people like Nancy Mace, people who could discuss racism in the abstract, but couldn't handle being called out for perpetuating it. People who saw themselves as allies until the moment their own comfort was challenged. "Furthermore," Mace continued, her voice rising to a level that made several committee members wince, "I think it's rich. It's absolutely rich to be lectured about racism by someone who sees everything, and I mean everything, through the lens of race. Not every problem in America is about skin color, and not every solution requires dividing people into oppressor and oppressed categories." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Several committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A reporter in the gallery whispered urgently into her phone. This was no longer a policy debate. It was becoming something much more dangerous, personal, raw, the kind of exchange that ends careers. But Jasmine's response was measured, surgical, delivered with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire professional life. "I appreciate my colleague's passion," she said, her voice so calm it created an almost disturbing contrast with Mace's agitation. "But I'd like to remind her that I didn't bring race into this discussion. Reality did. The statistics I cited aren't about seeing everything through the lens of race. They're about acknowledging that race has been used as a lens to deny opportunity for centuries." She paused, not for dramatic effect, but to choose her next words with absolute precision. "And I'd venture to say that someone who has never had to worry about their child being seen as a threat simply for existing might have a different perspective on these issues than someone who has." That's when Nancy Mace made the mistake that would define the rest of her career. Nancy Mace's face flushed deep red. The careful composure she'd maintained throughout her political career cracked like ice under pressure. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles went white, and when she leaned forward toward her microphone, her voice was loud enough to make the audio system crackle with feedback. "You know what?" she snapped, all pretense of political decorum abandoned. "I'm tired of this victim mentality. I'm tired of being told I can't understand because I'm white. I'm tired of having every policy discussion turned into a racial grievance session. And I'm tired of..." She paused, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to control herself. The pause stretched for 3 seconds, an eternity in live television, while 17 million viewers watched a woman in a position of power completely lose her composure on national television. Then, looking directly at Jasmine Crockett with undisguised contempt, Nancy Mace said the words that would haunt her forever. "You people are always causing trouble." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum, as if every molecule of oxygen had been sucked out of Committee Room 2154. 17 million viewers watching on C-SPAN, CNN, Fox News, and dozens of streaming platforms held their breath simultaneously. The usual background noise of any government hearing, the hum of air conditioning, the scratch of pens on paper, the rustle of clothing, the soft murmur of whispered conversations, all of it stopped. A young staffer in the back row dropped her pen. The sound of it hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot in the absolute silence. A reporter from the Washington Post, a 30-year veteran of political coverage, found his mouth falling open as his prepared questions evaporated from his mind. He knew, with the instinct of someone who had covered politics for 3 decades, that he had just witnessed a career-ending moment. Chairman Williams reached for his gavel, then stopped, his hand frozen in mid-air as if he couldn't quite process what he'd just heard. His parliamentary training had prepared him for heated exchanges, for personal attacks, even for outright hostility between committee members. But this was different. This was something that crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Committee members on both sides of the aisle sat frozen, their carefully neutral expressions replaced by shock, discomfort, and, in some cases, barely concealed horror. Republican Congresswoman Sarah Martinez closed her eyes and shook her head slightly, recognizing political suicide when she heard it. Democratic Congressman James Chen actually pushed back from the table, as if trying to distance himself from what had just occurred. But all eyes, every camera, every reporter, every person in that chamber, were on Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She didn't show even the slightest reaction to what had just been said. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her hands folded calmly on the table, her expression unreadable. It was the kind of stillness that comes not from shock, but from a lifetime of preparation for exactly this moment. For 10 seconds, an eternity in live television, she said nothing. But her silence was louder than any response could have been. It was the sound of dignity in the face of degradation. It was the weight of history settling into the present moment. It was the quiet before a storm that would reshape the political landscape. Across the country, in living rooms and offices, in classrooms and coffee shops, people found themselves leaning forward, unconsciously holding their breath as they waited to see how one of the few black women in Congress would respond to being called "you people" on national television. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was actually 12 seconds, Jasmine leaned forward slightly. Her voice, when it came, was so quiet that every person in the room had to strain to hear her, so soft that the microphones barely picked it up, but somehow it filled every corner of the chamber. "Congresswoman Mace," she said, each word carefully measured, precisely delivered. "Did you just refer to me as you people?" It wasn't really a question. It was a reckoning. It was the sound of someone refusing to let a moment of hatred pass unchallenged. It was 17 million Americans being asked to witness what they had just heard and decide what kind of country they wanted to live in. Nancy Mace's face went from red to pale in an instant. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again without any sound coming out. For the first time in her political career, the woman who had built her reputation on never being at a loss for words was speechless. Jasmine continued, her voice still barely above a whisper but somehow filling every millimeter of space in Committee Room 2154. "Because if you did, and the 17 million people watching this heard what I heard, then we need to have a different conversation than the one we started with." She paused, not for dramatic effect, but to choose her words with the precision of a surgeon selecting an instrument. Every word that came next would be analyzed, replayed, quoted, and remembered. She understood the weight of the moment and the responsibility it carried. We need to talk about what it means when a sitting member of Congress uses language that reduces another human being to "you people," simply because she doesn't like what that person is saying about documented racial inequities in our education system. The cameras were recording everything, but they couldn't capture the electrical charge in the air. They couldn't show how every person in that room suddenly understood they were witnessing something that would be replayed, analyzed, and remembered long after all of them were gone. Jasmine opened her folder and removed a single photograph, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. She held it up so everyone could see, a black and white image of a young girl walking up the steps of a school, surrounded by angry white faces contorted with hate. "This is Ruby Bridges," Jasmine said, her voice steady and clear. "She was 6 years old when she integrated William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans in 1960. The people screaming at her, threatening her, spitting at her. They also said 'you people' when they talked about why she didn't belong in their school." She set the photograph down gently on the table, positioning it so the cameras could capture it clearly. "The phrase 'you people' has a very specific history in this country, Congresswoman Mace. It's not neutral language. It's not accidentally divisive. It's the language of separation, of othering, of reducing human beings to something less than fully American." The impact of the photograph was immediate and visceral. Several committee members were visibly moved. Republican Congressman David Walsh, a father of 3, stared at the image with obvious discomfort. Democratic Congresswoman Lisa Rodriguez had tears in her eyes. "When you use that phrase in this chamber, you're not just speaking to me," Jasmine continued. "You're speaking to every person who has ever been told they don't belong somewhere because of what they look like. You're speaking to every child who has ever been made to feel like an outsider in their own country. You're speaking to every American who has ever been reduced to 'you people' by someone who thinks their citizenship is somehow more valid than ours." Nancy Mace finally found her voice, but it came out as a broken whisper. "I didn't mean, that's not what I was talking about people who always—" "What you meant," Jasmine interrupted gently but firmly, "and what you said are two different things. And right now, 17 million Americans heard what you said. More importantly, they heard the contempt in your voice when you said it." She stood up slowly, not in anger, but with the kind of controlled power that comes from absolute moral certainty. The movement was so deliberate, so purposeful, that it commanded everyone's attention even more completely than her words had. "You want to talk about people who are always causing trouble? Let me tell you what causes trouble in America." Her voice was stronger now, not louder, but more forceful, carrying the weight of generations of accumulated pain and dignity. Trouble is caused when people in positions of power use that power to diminish others. Trouble is caused when elected officials forget that they represent all of their constituents, not just the ones who look like them, or think like them, or vote like them. Trouble is caused when we pretend that the language of division is somehow separate from the reality of inequality. The room was transfixed. Even the Republican members of the committee, who had started the hearing as Nancy Mace's allies, were leaning forward, hanging on every word. They recognized, perhaps despite themselves, that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a master class in how to respond to hatred, not with hatred, but with dignity, facts, and moral clarity. Jasmine reached into her folder and pulled out a familiar document, a copy of the Constitution of the United States, its pages marked with small sticky notes and careful annotations. "This is the Congressional oath of office that we all took," she said, holding the document up so everyone could see it. "Every single person in this room swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and to bear true faith and allegiance to the same." She opened to a page marked with a red tab and read aloud, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." She looked up from the document, her eyes moving slowly across the committee, making eye contact with each member before finally settling on Nancy Mace. "The Constitution doesn't say anything about you people and us people, Congresswoman Mace. It talks about we the people, all of us together. It doesn't qualify that phrase with skin color or political party or regional origin. It doesn't say we the people who agree with each other or we the people who look alike. It says we the people, period." The weight of those words settled over the room like a blessing and a challenge simultaneously. This wasn't just a civics lesson. It was a moral reckoning disguised as constitutional interpretation. "So here's what I'm going to do, Congresswoman," Jasmine continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone making an offer they know will be refused. "I'm going to give you an opportunity to clarify what you meant when you said, you people. Because the alternative is that 17 million Americans are going to draw their own conclusions about what kind of person uses that language in the halls of Congress when discussing the educational needs of American children." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Everyone in the room understood what Jasmine was doing. She was giving Nancy Mace a chance to salvage something from the wreckage of her political career. It was an act of grace that many wouldn't have extended in similar circumstances. Nancy Mace's response came out in a jumbled rush, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to undo what couldn't be undone. "I was referring to, what I meant was, people who always see everything as racist. Not specifically. I wasn't talking about race. I was talking about people who make everything about identity politics instead of focusing on real solutions." But it was too late. The damage was done, and everyone in the room knew it. You can't unsay words that reveal your true feelings, especially when those words are broadcast live to 17 million people and recorded for posterity. The attempted clarification only made things worse, because it revealed that Nancy Mace still didn't understand what she had done wrong. Jasmine nodded slowly, as if Mace's stammering response was exactly what she'd expected. "I appreciate the attempt at clarification, Congresswoman, but clarification doesn't change what was said or what was meant, and it certainly doesn't change what was heard by the millions of Americans who are watching this." She began gathering her papers with deliberate calm, each movement precise and purposeful. "I came here today to talk about educational equity, to discuss how we can better serve all of America's children, regardless of their zip code or the color of their skin. What I discovered is that some of my colleagues aren't ready for that conversation because they're still struggling with basic respect for their fellow human beings." The words landed like a series of hammer blows, each sentence delivered with surgical precision, designed not to wound, but to reveal. Nancy Mace sat frozen, her political career cracking apart in real time on national television, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "You see, this is exactly why we need educational equity programs," Jasmine continued, her voice never rising above conversational volume, but somehow dominating the entire room. "Because the attitudes on display here today, the unconscious bias, the casual dismissiveness, the inability to hear criticism without resorting to othering language, these attitudes don't just exist in Congress. They exist in our schools, in our workplaces, in our communities." She turned to address the cameras directly, speaking not just to the committee but to the millions watching at home, in classrooms, in break rooms, wherever Americans were witnessing this moment of truth. When children see their elected representatives using language like "you people," what message does that send? When young Americans watch adults in positions of power reduce complex discussions about fairness and equality to personal attacks and racial othering, what are they learning about how democracy is supposed to work? The room was absolutely silent, except for the soft whir of cameras and the scratch of reporters' pens against paper. Even the most veteran political journalists recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a complete dismantling of a colleague's credibility in real time, done not with shouting or theatrical gestures, but with the quiet power of moral authority. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She reached into her folder one more time and pulled out a letter, its edges slightly yellowed with age, the paper soft from decades of careful handling. The handwriting was precise and deliberate, the ink faded but still legible. "I want to share something personal with you," she said, holding the letter with obvious reverence. "This was written by my grandmother in 1963. She was a teacher in rural Alabama, and she wrote this letter to the Montgomery County School Board when they refused to let her teach white children because, and I quote directly from their response, 'You people don't have the proper qualifications to educate our children.'" The emotional impact was immediate. Several committee members were visibly moved. The harsh political atmosphere of moments before had been replaced by something more human, more real. Jasmine unfolded the letter carefully, as if it were a sacred text. "My grandmother, Dolores Crockett, had a master's degree in education from Tuskegee Institute. She had 15 years of teaching experience. She had recommendations from principals, parents, and community leaders. She could speak 3 languages and had published articles on childhood development. But none of that mattered, because she was you people." Nancy Mace had gone completely pale. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she seemed to be trying to disappear into her chair. The connection between her words and the historical pattern Jasmine was revealing was impossible to ignore. Jasmine began to read from the letter, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "To the Honorable School Board members, I am writing to express my continued interest in the teaching position at Jefferson Elementary School. I understand that my qualifications have been questioned, and I welcome the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities through any examination or evaluation you deem appropriate. I believe that education is the great equalizer in our society, and I am committed to serving all children regardless of their background or circumstances. I have dedicated my life to learning and teaching because I believe that knowledge has the power to transform lives and communities. I hope you will reconsider your decision and give me the opportunity to contribute to the education of all the children in our community." She looked up from the letter, her eyes glistening but her voice remaining strong. "My grandmother never got that job, Congresswoman Mace. Not because she wasn't qualified. She was more qualified than most of the people who were hired instead of her. She didn't get the job because she was you people. And 60 years later, I'm sitting in the United States Congress, representing the people of Texas, and I'm hearing the same language from a colleague who is supposed to represent the interests of all Americans." The emotional weight of the moment was crushing. Several committee members were visibly moved to tears. Republican Congressman David Walsh was staring down at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Democratic Congresswoman Lisa Rodriguez had stopped taking notes and was simply listening, recognizing that she was witnessing something that transcended normal political discourse. Jasmine folded the letter carefully and placed it back in her folder, but the impact of her grandmother's words continued to resonate through the chamber. "So when you say, 'You people are always causing trouble,' Congresswoman Mace, you're not just talking to me. You're talking to my grandmother, who spent her life trying to educate children and was told she wasn't good enough because of her skin color. You're talking to Ruby Bridges, who faced hatred and violence as a 6-year-old because she had the audacity to want an education. You're talking to every person who has ever been told they don't belong somewhere because of what they look like rather than what they contribute." She stood up again, this time with complete finality. The movement was so decisive that it seemed to shift the energy of the entire room. "And you're talking to the millions of Americans who are watching this right now, trying to decide whether their government truly represents them or whether it still sees them as you people, who should be grateful for whatever scraps of equality they're given." The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of an awkward moment. It was the heavy silence of recognition, of a truth so obvious and undeniable that it couldn't be argued with or spun away. Chairman Williams finally found his voice, but it came out smaller than usual, diminished by the gravity of what had just occurred. "The committee will stand in recess for 15 minutes while we..." But his words were drowned out by the explosion of activity in the gallery. Reporters were already filing stories, their fingers flying across phone keyboards and laptop keys. Photographers were capturing every angle of Nancy Mace's shell. Shocked expression, of Jasmine's dignified composure, of the other committee members struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Staffers were whispering urgently into phones, trying to manage a crisis that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't participating in the chaos. She calmly gathered her papers, closed her folder, tucked her grandmother's letter safely away, and walked toward the exit with the same measured pace she'd maintained throughout the entire exchange. She didn't hurry, despite the shouted questions from reporters. She didn't pause for photographs or offer any additional comments. Her work was done, and she knew it. As she moved through the gallery, people instinctively moved aside, not out of fear, but out of respect. She had just accomplished something remarkable. She had responded to hatred, not with hatred, but with dignity, history, and moral clarity. She had taken a moment of personal attack and transformed it into a teaching moment for the entire country. Behind her, Nancy Mace sat alone at the committee table, abandoned by staffers who were too busy doing damage control to offer comfort. Her political career hadn't just been wounded. It had been surgically dismantled by a woman who understood that the most powerful weapon against ignorance isn't anger, but education. As Jasmine reached the exit, a young reporter called out, "Congresswoman Crockett, how do you respond to those who say you made this about race when it was supposed to be about education?" She turned, looked directly into the camera that had swung to follow her, and delivered the line that would become her signature, the quote that would be repeated in classrooms and quoted in history books. "I didn't make this about race. America's history made this about race. I just refuse to pretend otherwise. The question isn't whether I said too much. It's whether America is finally ready to listen to what it's been trying not to hear for centuries." With that, she walked through the doors and into the hallway, leaving behind a committee room full of people trying to process what they had just witnessed, and a nation that would spend the next weeks, months, and years debating the implications of three simple words: "You people." Within hours, the clip had exploded across every social media platform imaginable. The hashtag #YouPeopleNeverAgain was trending worldwide within 6 hours. Dignity in action followed close behind. News anchors struggled to find ways to contextualize what they'd witnessed. Political commentators debated whether Jasmine's response was appropriate, but their arguments felt hollow against the raw power of the moment itself. The numbers were staggering. 50 million views across all platforms within 24 hours. 100 million within a week. But more than the numbers, it was the quality of engagement that mattered. This wasn't just viral content. It was a moment that changed how people thought about representation, dignity, and the power of responding to hatred with grace. Nancy Mace's political career never recovered. Within 72 hours, her communications director had resigned. Major donors pulled their support. Her approval ratings in her own district plummeted by 30 points in a single week. But beyond the political consequences, she had become a symbol of something larger. The cost of letting prejudice override profession